my colleagues to join us in supporting the First Step Act, bipartisan legislation that will make needed changes to federal sentencing rules and prison reforms. A number of us have been working on this issue for years, but I do want to thank Chairman Grassley, who's here with us today, and Senator Feinstein for their leadership in getting it through the Judiciary Committee, as well as Senator Durbin, who has been a long-time leader on this issue, Senator Booker, who has worked so hard on this as well, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Cornyn, who's here with us today, and many others Senator Leahy, who has really made this and took on this cause at times when it wasn't as easy as it is right now at the end of the year. And I want to thank the administration for working with us on this bill as well. As the former chief prosecutor in Minnesota's largest county, I understand the need to use our resources to target the most serious offenders to maintain public safety. You have to make decisions in those kinds of jobs every day. Decisions about your priorities, where you're going to put your criminal justice money, what's the safest thing to do for the community, and knowing that a number of our offenders do re-enter into society, what is the best way to make sure that if they do come back into society, that they're going to be functioning members of society, that they are not going to go back to drugs, or that they are not going to commit additional crimes. So all of those things, it's fine to just pretend that it's not happening, that people are going away forever, and some people rightfully do. Violent criminals, murderers, they don't come out again. But a number of the other offenders do come out again. So the question is, what do we do to make it most safe for our community and to allow them to be functioning members of our society? That is really what this bill is about at its core. We need a justice system that both protects the victims of crime and punishes those who break the law. One time, someone once said that prosecutors, my old job, were ministers of justice. And that's what we're doing with this bill here. We are acknowledging that there are issues with our criminal justice system that we have to deal with. We're not just closing our eyes and pretending it's fine to just pretend everyone goes away forever. Well, we know they don't. So some people are coming out, and they should come back out again. And the First Step Act gets at those hard issues. Our criminal justice system must administer justice fairly. The sentencing laws on low-level drug offenders were implemented decades ago, and in a number of cases, they have diverted limited law enforcement resources away from important public safety initiatives that would allow us to actually go after violent criminals, and they have resulted in prison sentences that don't actually fit the crime. Today, our country has over 20% of the world's incarcerated people, even though we only have less than 5% of the world's population. We need a criminal justice system that works for our communities. That's why I've fought for bipartisan criminal justice reform for years. As a former prosecutor, I've long supported important policies, including more law enforcement resources. I lead that bill with Senator Murkowski on the COPS program to get more law enforcement resources to our police. I think that is very important. I worked hand in hand with our local police in Minnesota for 8 years. They have very hard jobs. As a former prosecutor, I've also supported important policies that make it better for the community and the police to work together. That includes better training for our law enforcement. That includes videotaped interrogations. That includes reforms to the eyewitness process. We were one of the first states that made some changes there. That includes body cameras, diversity in hiring, and meaningful work between law enforcement and our citizens, fair jury selection processes. There are a number of things that we have done but must continue to do to increase that trust between the community and our law enforcement. As a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I've supported the Bipartisan Sentencing Reform and Correction Act for years. My colleagues and I worked across party lines to pass that bill out of committee earlier in February and last Congress as well. Although the bill was never brought to the floor of the Senate until this week, today we finally have an opportunity to make meaningful progress. The First Step Act represents a concerted, bipartisan effort to strike an effective balance to improve the fair administration of justice while keeping our communities safe. Even though this bill is not perfect, it is a result of compromises between two sides and people with a lot of different views and many groups that are here to advocate for citizens. It is a compromise that has the endorsement of groups, and we don't usually see this, ranging from the Fraternal Order of Police to the ACLU. This bill represents a critical opportunity that shouldn't be lost. One of the most important reforms in this bill are the changes to mandatory minimums. We all know people who've been caught up in a criminal justice system that can be unfair. I believe strongly in enforcing our laws on the books and putting criminal offenders behind bars to protect public safety. But for nonviolent, low-level drug offenders, there are more innovative and evidence-based ways to deal with them than longer prison sentences. The First Step Act allows judges to sentence below the mandatory minimum for low-level nonviolent drug offenders who work with the government. It also reduces some of the longest sentences now in the books, including decreasing the second strike mandatory minimum of 20 years to 15 years, and reduces the third strike mandatory minimum of life in prison to 25 years. This bill includes a crucial provision to allow people who were sentenced under discriminatory drug laws, which required a longer mandatory minimum sentence for the possession of crack than for the possession of the same amount of cocaine, to petition to be resentenced under the reform guidelines that we passed in 2010. Significantly, this bill will not automatically reduce any one person's prison sentence. Instead, the bill simply allows people to petition courts and prosecutors for an individualized review based on the particular facts of their case. That is what justice is supposed to be about. It is not always a one-size-fits-all. It gives the people that work in the justice system, knowing that you have mandatory minimums that are still in place, knowing that you want to have fairness across the system, but it allows judges and prosecutors to look at an individualized case and decide what's best for public safety and what's best for the community. By giving prosecutors and judges this discretion, we will give them the tools to better see that justice is done. The First Step Act also incorporates much-needed reforms to our federal prisons to treat people more humanely and to encourage participation in programs intended to help people from committing another crime after their release. In my old job as Hennepin County Attorney, I always said we would try as much as possible to run our office like a business. We would be efficient. We would keep track of what we were doing. We would be accountable to the public and show them what the results were with regard to our prosecutions and the numbers and what the sentences would be. We did all that. But one of the things that I also knew was that while you want to run government as much as possible, as efficiently as a business, there's one way that we weren't like a business in the criminal justice system. We did not want to see repeat customers in our doors. That is not what you want when you're running a prosecutor's office. We wanted to make sure that people could get their lives back and their acts together so they didn't keep cycling through the criminal justice system. This bill, the First Step Act, includes a provision to require that federal prisoners be placed at a facility as close to their primary residence as possible. That makes sure that families aren't separated and they can continue to have visitors. One of the things that we know is really important for them to make that transition when they get back in the community. This straightforward change is an important step toward reducing recidivism because research suggests that people who maintain contact with their families while they serve time are less likely to commit crimes after they are released. Other key provisions in this legislation expand access to treatment and education. I look at this two ways. One, when I first became a lawyer at a private law firm in the Twin Cities, I actually got involved in a program called Amicus, where we went to visit people in the prison. And I visited a woman through a number of years until I became the chief DA. That got a little awkward. But she went on to serve her sentence and go back out into the community. And that program was really the community saying, we want to keep the thought out there that there is hope, that these people are going to get out at some point, and that you have role models and people that are willing to work with them. So I saw that work with my own eyes. The other reason I care so much about this part of the bill is that I am a child of an alcoholic, of someone who went through treatment, who after a number of DWIs was finally pushed into treatment, and it changed his life. In his own words, he was pursued by grace. And I think that other people, whether they're in the prison system or not, should be able to have that same opportunity for themselves and for their kids. I was able to see my dad literally climb the highest mountains as an adventurer and a mountain climber and a columnist, but sink to the lowest valleys because of the disease of alcoholism. And you see that all the time in our prison system, whether it's drugs, whether it is alcohol. That is one of the reasons that people get involved in crime, to feed their addiction or because they're not functioning normally and making decisions that they would make if they weren't addicted. This bill encourages the use of evidence-based treatment for opioid and heroin abuse and will help to address the addiction that is the root cause of so many crimes. I come from a state that believes in treatment. We're known as the land of 10,000 lakes, and every so often people jokingly call it the land of 10,000 treatment centers. That includes, of course, Betty Ford, Hazleton, we're very proud of their work, but also multiple other treatment centers in our state. And it's a major part of our criminal justice system and our drug court. We had one of the first major drug courts in the country, and I've continued to carry on that work as a senator. Taken together, the prison reforms in this bill and the recidivism reforms and the reentry reforms are an important step that will help us to make progress toward reducing the number of repeat offenders. As a prosecutor, I always believed that our job was to serve the cause of justice. That was to convict the guilty, but protect the innocent. And sometimes the innocent are, of course, the victims of crimes. That's the first thing that comes to your mind. But the innocent are also people who are unfairly accused of crimes, and that's why it's so important to have all these measures in place, whether it is videotaped interrogations or jury selection that's fair, to make sure our process is fair. But at some point, when someone has served their sentence and turned their life around, they go from guilty, which they once were, to having a chance to go out there as an innocent person that's just trying to lead their lives. That's what our job is as senators, to do justice, to make sure that we have rules in place that make sure the guilty go behind bars if they've committed a serious crime, but that we protect the innocent. And that includes the families of victims, but also the families of offenders. There is still much work for us to do to improve our criminal justice system. And I'm committed with my colleagues, and so many of them I mentioned earlier that have been leaders on this bill. I see Senator Leahy here from the state of Vermont, the former chair of the Judiciary Committee, who worked so hard on this as well. So many people have contributed to the effort, from the left and from the right, from the Democratic Party and from the Republican Party. This is a victory for justice today as we consider this bill. I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, before I begin, I would note my long friendship with the presiding officer. I was delighted to see him come back to the Senate. I wish him well now as he leaves the Senate. Let you know you're always welcome by both Democrats and Republicans when you come back, and I realize the presiding officer is constrained and cannot respond to whatever I say about him, but I assure him that I'll stay within the Senate rules and say only nice things, because that's all I know about him. And I want to thank the senator from Minnesota who has just spoken. She, like me, is a former prosecutor. I've often said that's the best job I've ever had, and my wife Marcelle told me that she may remind me of some of those times at 3 a.m. in the morning when I was going to murder scenes, that maybe it is easier being in the Senate and you can sleep all night. But what we are doing, and this is where a lot of those of us who have been prosecutors, both Republicans and Democrats, or those who have been defense attorneys, Republicans and Democrats, have come together. And because of that, the Senate is considering perhaps the most significant bill to reform our criminal justice system in nearly a decade. The First Step Act takes modest but important steps to remedy some of the most troubling injustices within our sentencing laws and our prison system. It is my hope this bill represents not just a single piece of legislation, but a turning point in how Congress views its role in advancing criminal justice, because there will be a lot of advances we must look at. I've been working to bring fairness to our criminal justice system for decades, both before I was in the Senate and since I've been in the Senate. For far too long, the legislative response to any and all public safety concerns was as simple as it was flawed. No matter the perceived ill, we turned to arbitrary and inflexible mandatory minimums to cure it. That was a knee-jerk response, and I believe it's changing. I truly believe the era of mandatory minimum sentencing is coming to an end. Today, there's a growing recognition that one-size-fits-all sentencing is neither just nor effective. It routinely results in low-level offenders spending far longer in prison than either public safety or common sense requires. It comes at a steep human cost, especially in communities of color. It also comes at a steep fiscal cost that leaves us less safe. The United States houses more prisoners and has higher incarceration rates than any other country in the world. This is not something for Americans to point to with pride. The cost of housing federal offenders consumes nearly 1/3 of the Justice Department's budget. And because public safety dollars are finite, this strips critical resources away from law enforcement strategies that have been proven to make our communities safer. If we take steps to responsibly reduce our prison population, we can save both money and reduce crime. That's a lesson states across the country have already learned. Prison rates and crime rates can fall together, and it's past time for the federal criminal justice system to catch up with the states. 5 years ago, as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and drawing on my own experiences as a prosecutor, I convened hearings and advanced the core pieces of legislation that now form the basis of the First Step Act. And despite strong bipartisan votes in committee, at the time some doubted we have had the support needed to ensure passage on the Senate floor. Each year since then, an expanding group of dedicated senators and advocates have methodically built support for these reforms. And today that support is outstanding. Somebody said it was bipartisan. It's more than that. It's nonpartisan. And with the efforts of Senator Durbin, who has been championing these efforts as long as anyone, along with Senators Grassley, White House, Lee, Booker, and others, we now stand poised to pass meaningful criminal justice reform for the first time in a decade. Now, it's true This legislation doesn't go as far as I would like, far from it. I support ending mandatory minimum sentence. I would prefer to do more to fix racially disparate treatment. I'd like to see the full elimination of the existing crack, powder, cocaine disparity. That's a glaring injustice we must eventually address. What we have in that crack and powder cocaine, you can have a well-respected person on Wall Street or in a law firm or anywhere else buy a certain amount of money, spend a certain amount of money for powder cocaine. You can have somebody in the inner city spend exactly the same amount for crack cocaine. The person who has the good social standing will be told, what a terrible thing you've done. You may have to spend a few weekends volunteering at soup kitchens, and we hope you don't do it again. The person from the inner city spending the exact same amount on crack cocaine is going to have a mandatory sentence in prison. I'd like to see a broader judicial safety valve. I'd like to see additional retroactive activity. Any laws that we consider unjust today were just as unjust yesterday or a year ago or even a decade ago. It should be retroactive, but this is the nature of a compromise. You don't get everything you want. And when I look at the scope of the reforms before us today, including a modest expansion of the safety valve, retroactive application of the Fair Sentencing Act, a reduction of some of the most indefensible mandatory minimums on the books, as well as reforms to add evidence-based practices to our prison system and reentry efforts, then I believe this is an historic achievement. The First Step Act also includes my Second Chance Reauthorization Act that I introduced with Senator Portman. Our bill both extends and improves federal grant programs, providing reentry services to ex-offenders. Now include employment assistance, housing, substance abuse treatment, victim support, and more. Because let's look at it. Almost every single offender in our justice system someday is going to be released. We owe it both to them and to the communities where they will live to ensure they can lead productive lives. And in many ways, the First Step Act represents the best of the Senate. It represents what this institution is capable when senators listen to each other and when they come together to solve complex and contentious issues instead of exploiting them for momentary political gain. When senators are willing to be patient, to compromise, to persist through inevitable setbacks, real progress is possible. When senators, no matter what their political party, understand that each one of us is here to be part of the conscience of the nation, and we should work together. So for the remaining members of the Senate not yet ready to support this legislation, I hope you'll reconsider. I hope you'll review the breadth of bipartisan support, both here in the Congress and in the White House and in the broader stakeholder community. I hope you will consider why even important law enforcement voices, like the Fraternal Order of Police and the National District Attorneys Association, support this bill. And for the members who do support the First Step Act, I hope that you will continue to work to reform our criminal justice system in the years ahead. Many of our laws are based on decades-old misguided assumptions. They don't reflect what we know from the true evidence. There's still so much work to be done. And there's still so many injustices and racial disparities to address. So this week we're showing what's possible. By working together, we can continue to enact meaningful legislation. In the years to come, they'll keep us safe and save money. Improve America is a nation of fairness and second chances. This is a carefully negotiated compromise. I hope all members will vote no on amendments to this carefully negotiated compromise and vote yes on final passage. This former prosecutor would be very happy if we do.
And live outside the Senate chamber now, as typical on a Tuesday, senators wrapping up their weekly caucus meetings, their weekly conference lunches. We may hear from Republican and Democratic senators if we get a chance.